Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Coming up on our program, reporters from Youth Radio examine sex trafficking in Oakland. And the first graphic novelist to be named National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. But first, a look back at the GOP convention that wrapped up in Cleveland and a look forward as the Democrats gear up for their convention kicking off on Monday. This week was supposed to be a chance to rally the GOP around the nomination of Donald Trump, but in a primetime speech, Senator Ted Cruz refused, evoking boos from many of the delegates. And on the Democratic side, after a lengthy nomination fight with Bernie Sanders, how will Hillary Clinton use the convention in Philadelphia to fire up her party's base and win over swing voters? Joining me now is Democratic strategist Mary Hughes, Republican strategist Sean Walsh, and KQED political reporter Marisa Lagos. Welcome to you all. Well, what a week it's been, huh, Sean? You were there. You just came back from the convention this morning. Law and order was very much the main theme of Donald Trump's speech last night. In fact, he said it at least 4 times in his speech. Was it enough to unify the Republican Party?
Actually, the message wasn't to unify the Republican Party. The message was to actually get the attention of the entire country. So, you know, in our country right now, it seems like the best of times, the worst of times. There's a real unsettled feeling in the country with a lot of the officers shot that we are losing control. Some of the crime statistics out today saying that 16% violent crime is up. So that message was designed to play on people's insecurities and anxieties, but not only in the domestic level, but in the foreign level.
Is that a good message, though? I mean, at many conventions, you hear messages of hope and inspiration and aspiration. This was very much depicting a country that seems in chaos. It was dark. It was angry.
Well, I think that the reality and the perception are in 2 different places right now. I think the reality is America, many of our inner cities are on the rise. Cleveland is a fantastic city that really has come back. But the perception is that we're out of control with regards to foreign terrorism threats, domestic criminal activities, and other issues. So the perception right now is driving a lot of the electorate, and that is the belief of Mr. Trump.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that was is a calculation that we don't know yet how it's going to go. I mean, you're right. There are some cities where crime is up, and there are certainly always statistics there. But in general, America's pretty safe right now. And so I think that we have a lot of fear. We have a lot of fear about foreign terrorism, as Sean mentioned. We have a lot of fear about what we hear in the news or on media. But will that sort of play out and get those independent voters that Trump needs? I mean, I'm not sure that's a calculation that's going to play out.
Mary?
Well, historically, we've looked at the economy as the bellwether of where voters would go. And it was interesting to me that there was virtually no discussion of the economy, the domestic economy, where unemployment here in California is below 5%, where the number of jobs created just last month here was 40,000. So the economy over the last 8 years has undeniably improved dramatically across the country, and there wasn't a whiff of that, understandably.
But there was, actually. So that plays into the underlying fear, quite candidly, of immigrants coming in here and taking jobs away from folks in Cleveland and Buffalo and Akron, Ohio. I think the insecurities of people from their job perspective, automation of their jobs. Right now, as we're speaking, there's an active shooting situation going on in Germany right now, and that plays right into the fears and right into the message that was put forward.
But that's the base, and I think that's the question is that a message that gets forward to the people that Trump does need to win over again? And I do think that you heard a lot of, coded language this week about that base, about a lot of people who do feel that, this country is not the place that maybe their parents grew up in. But again, I think it's going to be interesting to see, at a convention this week where we saw a lot of anger at Hillary Clinton, the lock 'em up chant sort of became the mantra. What do Democrats do, to push back on that? Are they going to look at this from a sort of more fear perspective, or try to go back to 2008 with this message of hope? So there's a lot kind of happening, I think, between the two.
Well, the Republican Party obviously needs more women voters. It needs more non-white voters. Is that message good enough to convince those voters to get into the tent?
There was a dual message here. I was skeptical putting so many of your kids up there to talk about you. I think that can have a negative effect. But in this instance, where the public doesn't know Donald Trump and what they see is kind of an acerbic, the quintessential in-your-face New Yorker, they really softened him up. They made him to be like a family man. He cares about his kids, he cares about his workers. These kids turned out okay, so he must have some positive, warm attributes. I think it was a good move on their part, so I think that softened up.
But wasn't it was a bit risky, as Marisa said, in this sense. The Donald Trump who advances the issues under the big umbrella of fear also is a Donald Trump who is vulnerable on, for example, on the trade issue. Here's the guy whose company and whose clothes are produced in factories outside of the United States. Here's the guy whose bankruptcies hurt when we got the blue-collar billionaire presentation. But when you go and scratch the surface in Atlantic City, what you find are small business people and craftsmen who, when the bankruptcies came, they bore the brunt of that. And so I wondered, as I listened to this outstretched warmth toward folks who do have it hard, whether under much scrutiny that would stand up.
Look, our country, for better or worse, is going through some very, wrenching time periods. Jobs are changing, mechanization is changing. I feel we're back a little bit towards the Nixon era. And so the Trump campaign is going towards a Nixon strategy. It's the hard hat strategy. I think the Clinton campaign is making a disastrous mistake, as are the Democrats, by putting up a lot of these families who have been shot by the police.
But is it a smart strategy, though, to harken back to the era of Nixon? Because the society we had then is so different from what we have now. Back then, nearly 90% of the voters were white. We've got a situation now where the last presidential election, it was hovering around 70% white.
But it's not Nixon. It's talking about insecurities for jobs. It's talking about foreign insecurities. It's talking about domestic insecurities. So, and for a lot of Republicans, and I would argue for Democrats and independents, this isn't fear for them. This is real, honest-to-goodness concerns. And that's why Trump won in the primary, is because a lot of the Republican candidates, they refused to address issues that a lot of the electorate said they think are real problems. And so I do think this is a message, quite candidly, that will go beyond just the Republican base. Now, is it enough? I don't know. And again, he's vulnerable with moderate Republicans, and he's vulnerable with women. If they don't show up, he loses.
Yeah, I think that Mary hit on something, though, which is that Trump does have a tough needle to thread. He's put himself out here as this everyman. He's here to represent, these white workers who are falling from the middle class. But on the same, side of the coin, he's a real estate developer. He is he's a billionaire. That's also, and he's trying to, speak to everybody while also talk about how, he has been such a success and he's going to bring that success. So, and we saw a lot of that, I think, this week with the sort of almost wanting to have it both ways, and I think in times it worked and in other times it didn't. I do think it's worth mentioning how much, the message was knocked off by things like the Cruz speech, by things like Melania Trump's speech, and whether, and its similarities to Michelle Obama. I know Sean will say that's the media just focusing on the negative, but, it was the story and it was what people were talking about. So it was.
And Marisa and Mary, I know you're both going to the Democratic convention beginning Monday in Philadelphia. So Mary, what can we expect to see at that convention?
Two things. In a variety of ways. One is strength, the other is likability. I think you will find a warmth and a cohesive Democratic Party that represents and looks like the modern and forward-looking United States of America, and that has solutions. I think the breadth of her experience and the depth of detail by which she will tell you how she will proceed to answer the problems about fear and to solve some of our bigger problems will be clear and we hope not numbing detail, but nonetheless pretty specific.
Well, she clearly has the experience, but right. Polls show a majority of Americans, even those who say they will vote for Hillary Clinton, right. think trust is a liability for her. How does she overcome that? Can she overcome it?
Well, yes, she can overcome it, and I think there are a couple of things you can do. One is a simple one, which is simply to breathe. I think we see her often in these very tough and very memorable situations in her life when she is under intense scrutiny. And now she has won this nomination, something she has sought for a long time. And I think you will see the joy and the acceptance of the party's confidence, which is something she's been after for a while. And I think that you will also learn things about her, as we did about Mr. Trump, that show you the human being who is there. And as people learn more, I think their confidence will grow.
I think we're going to see a lot of contrast, as we've sort of already hit on here. I mean, this week, the convention started with a night, Make America Safe Again, and we did talk a lot about, public safety issues, immigrants killing people. We had speeches from police officers talking about police officers who have been killed. We had a speech from the father of somebody who was killed by an illegal immigrant. By contrast, the Democrats are opening up with First Lady Michelle Obama and a dreamer, a young immigrant who was here illegally but was given deportation relief from the Obama administration. I mean, just that, I think, shows you the way the Democratic Party is trying to position themselves in contrast. Sean also mentioned on, I believe, the second night, they're going to have this group of mothers, mother of Sandra Bland, who died in police custody, the mother of Eric Garner, who was shot by police. So they're really trying to set up this, a contrast with what we heard about, Sheriff Joe Arpaio and others last week. So it's certainly made for TV, let's say.
As of right now, Hillary Clinton has not announced her VP pick, but heavy speculation is that it will be Virginia Senator Tim Kaine. How do you think Bernie Sanders voters will react to that?
I think Bernie Sanders voters and Democrats across the board want to win. At this point, everyone understands that our big tent is only working if everybody gets underneath it. So I think they're in. I think they'll be for it. They got a good platform. They worked hard on it. Senator Sanders is in, and he held out a long time so that he would know his candidacy had been worthwhile. So I think, unlike the missed opportunities for unity that we saw, I think what you will see is people who say, this is not only worth it because I believe in what we're trying to do, but when you consider the alternative, nobody stays out.
Look, I think this is Hillary 10.0, so she's trying to remake herself for the 8th, 9th, 10th time. So I don't think it's a bad strategy for getting activist Democrats and the left-leaning Sanders voters to get on board. But there's still, I think, a perception that she's Wall Street's candidate. There is a real serious trust problem on her part, but there's also a trust problem on Donald Trump's part. So who do you trust more? I'm not sure where it ends up at the end of the day, but she has real issues.
Well, I think that if Tim Kaine is indeed the VP pick, that is a calculated strategy to go after some of those independent voters and others that Trump is playing for, right? I think there is a sense that they have brought a lot of Sanders supporters on board. If you look at polls, Clinton's in a better position than Obama was 8 years ago for her supporters. And so this is an attempt to sort of focus on the more moderate
Okay,
crowd.
and we'll have to leave it there. I'm sure you guys will all be back between now and Election Day. Thanks to you all. Sean Walsh, Marisa Lagos, and Mary Hughes.
Thank you.
Earlier this year, the Library of Congress chose the first graphic novelist to be the National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. Born and raised in the Bay Area, Gene Luen Yang has been drawing his own comics since grade school. His stories take on themes of race and identity, as well as superheroes and mythical lore. As ambassador, Yang wants to inspire America's young readers to open up their world through books. He joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, so you have been National Ambassador for Young People's Literature for a few months now. What has the experience been like so far?
It's been amazing. So it all started in January when I was invited over to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. There was this fancy ceremony. I put on a fancy suit. They gave me a fancy medal. Gave a speech about how much books mean to me. And then since then, I've done a couple of other speaking engagements.
What have books done for you and your life?
Books are huge. Books have formed me as a human being. Books have formed me as a cartoonist. One of the examples that I share in these speeches is how books have actually been like ambassadors for me. They've explained worlds that I just never understood before. So for instance, I don't know if you can tell, but I'm kind of a nerd, which means I grew up, like I was terrible at sports when I was growing up, and I never had any sort of interest in sports, especially basketball. For some reason, whenever I play basketball, the ball always ends up hitting me in the head, right? So I just tried for a really long time to stay away from that world as much as I could. Eventually, I got interested in basketball, and part of it is from books. I read this book called Outside the Paint, written by a woman named Kathleen Yep, and it's about the Chinese basketball scene in the 1940s in San Francisco.
And in fact, in your inaugural speech as ambassador, you talked about that. It was
That's right.
a beautiful speech. I read it. And you talked about reading without walls, how breaking down those walls really allowed you to learn about a whole new world of basketball that you had never been interested in.
That's absolutely right. I think that's such an important part of books. You know, we're all caught in our own brains. You know, we stew in our own thoughts. And books are really a way for us to experience life through somebody else, through somebody else's mind.
As a kid, what did you want to grow up to be?
When I was really little, I really wanted to be a Disney animator. You know, animation, animated movies, and animated television series. That was the first time I realized that you can tell stories by drawing. And I've always loved these two things, stories and drawing. So that's what I really wanted to do.
And then at what point did the writing part come in?
Well, in 5th grade, that's when I started reading comic books. You know, my mom bought me the Superman comic. And after I read that, my mind was just blown. You know, I realized that you could convey things through these still pictures on a printed page. In such emotional and effective ways. And I knew that that was something I wanted to do.
In fact, this book, American-Born Chinese, is the one that really catapulted you to national fame. It won the Michael Prince Award for Excellence in Young Adult Literature. It was the first graphic novel to accomplish that. What was your reaction?
It was that was crazy too. American-Born Chinese, the response for American-Born Chinese was really life-changing. You know, that book got so much support from librarians and teachers and readers in general. And that really marked a turning point in my career. So before that, every time I put out a comic book, I would lose money, you know? and then this was actually, you know, when I could finally tell my parents, oh, this is actually making a little bit of money now.
You can be proud now,
Yes.
because your parents are immigrants from Taiwan and Hong Kong.
That's
and you actually majored in computer science at UC Berkeley, partly to please them, but it wasn't your passion.
Well, I do love computers,
Yeah.
for sure, but my dad's very practical wishes for me also played a role.
The New York Times hailed your book, American-Born Chinese, as a dark exploration of Asian American adolescence that blends two cultures in, quote, inventive, unexpected ways. Are identity and culture the themes that you like to explore most in your works?
It does seem like I return to that over and over again. You know, I have a friend named Marisa Lagos, and she is a young adult author as well. And she says that at the heart of every young adult book is this equation, and that's power plus belonging is equal to identity. You know, and I really feel like that describes my work. My work is really about how young people find their power, how they find their voice, how they find their sense of belonging, and how that adds up to their identity.
And in fact, that is one of the reasons that you were drawn to Superman, right? Because you saw it
Absolutely.
through that lens.
Yeah, I've been a superhero fan in general for a long time, and Superman is the very first superhero, right? He's the one that established the conventions of that genre. He was created by the sons of poor Jewish immigrants, and I don't know if they did it consciously or not, but I really feel like they put a piece of the immigrant experience into that character. I mean, he really is an immigrant. He's from a different culture. He comes over to America, and he has to wrestle between these two cultures. He's a Kryptonian, and he's also an American. He has to figure out how these two things fit together.
And so you started working on Superman for DC Comics. Is that wrapping up now?
I did. I started my run on issue 41, which came out last summer, and issue 50, which was the end of my run, just published last month.
What will your next book be about?
Well, I am doing another book for DC Comics.
Oh, you are? Okay.
And it's called NEWSROOM. It's about a Chinese kid who grows up in Shanghai who inherits some of Superman's powers.
Oh, it's going to be an Asian Superman.
That's right. It's going to be an Asian Superman.
I think that's just awesome. As an immigrant, I find that very awesome.
I'm excited about it. We're all excited about it.
Yeah. And, you know, just a quick fun note. You live in the South Bay. You live in San Jose, not too far from where I grew up in San Jose. My mom still lives there. And your parents live in another part of the South Bay, not far from where I live now.
Yeah.
So just so you know, I've been stalking you, in case you did not know that, just for the record.
Well, one of our families is stalking the other one. We're not sure which one yet.
I knew you were destined for greatness, so I just thought, I'm following him.
Awesome.
All right, Gene Luen Yang, such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Bay Area law enforcement agencies have been roiled by allegations of officer sexual misconduct involving a young woman who calls herself Celeste Squap. While the news has sparked widespread dismay, those who work with sexually exploited youth say the case comes as no surprise. It's emblematic, they say, of a larger problem that can plague law enforcement agencies dealing with a vulnerable population. 2 reporters from Youth Radio have been covering a strip of Oakland's International Boulevard known as the Track, considered the city's red light district, and they join me now. Reporter Natalie Bettendorf and producer Denise Tejada. Pleasure to have you both here. Thank you so much. Natalie, the police misconduct case has, as we said, sparked much shock among the public. What was the reaction among youth service providers that you talked to?
So really what we saw in our reporting and interviewing this cross-section of youth service providers is that none of these service providers expressed any sort of same shock or similar kind of surprise that the public was expressing during this. And
Why is that?
I think a part of that reason is because they have seen from these victims and from these girls on the street that this is something that they see every day. And this is this kind of interaction between authorities with girls on the street and with girls who are really vulnerable out on the track. This is something that they have encountered before and all across the country. And so what they're telling us is that being shocked and being surprised actually, you know, is showing an issue of education in the public, and that maybe we need to not be as shocked and actually kind of realize that this is a problem that really is endemic in a lot of police departments across the country.
When you say endemic, how widespread is that problem, police taking advantage of young girls on the streets?
Yeah, well, the providers that we spoke to say, you know, we shouldn't be surprised if this is happening in other departments. So it's not from what I'm hearing is that it's not an isolated issue to just Oakland or to just Richmond or any other agency here in the Bay Area. You know, so I think that's what it is for a lot of the providers is, you know, if you know this work and you've been doing it and you've been, you know, continually working with the young girls, then you know that this is not an isolated issue to this department, and, you know, and that's so unfortunate.
There are certainly, though, good officers who genuinely want to help and try to help. Is there a conflict, though, between arresting them versus trying to rescue them from a law enforcement perspective?
Definitely, I think what we saw was that with this scandal, there's an increase in distrust on the streets. So really what youth service providers are saying that it's frustrating to have things like this happen when really they are depending on these police, and they're depending on the police department to work with them. They're their co-workers in helping save these girls. But really, when it comes to arresting versus rescuing, arresting them is really just getting the girls off the street, and maybe it's not necessarily getting them the help that they need, as opposed to, you know, just getting this girl who's been trafficked or who's in a really vulnerable situation just out into services. And so that's really the important part.
This is actually an issue we saw back in 2010 when we first started to look at this issue. And one of the areas that we focused on was when police officers arrest a girl, it's actually the opportunity to give them access to services. So that's where the contradiction happens. In one area, you're arresting a girl that's considered a victim of sexual exploitation, somebody that's constantly has been abused in every kind of way that you can think of. And so you arrest them, and then you give them access to services. So on one hand, she's a victim getting arrested, and that's the only way to get them to services first.
So then what do you want to see happen then? Do you want them to no longer be arrested and just be taken to services?
So here's one of the questions that came up in our reporting back in 2010. Like, you know, if a young girl, an underage girl, she's not, she doesn't have that age, or she can't consent to sex. So technically she's a victim. She's been, you know, you can even say it's rape. And so then you ask the question, can you essentially arrest a victim of rape, you know? But that's the tricky part is you they do arrest them, because otherwise, how do you get them off the street and into services?
It's a very opaque area. Natalie, I know that you spent time out on International Boulevard reporting this story, and you're in the process of finishing it up. It'll air on KQED radio next week. What did you see out there, and how do these girls end up on the streets?
Well, really what we saw out on International is we were taken by some service providers from Baywar, and they actually showed us, International, which is also known as the track. It's kind of a slang term that people will use around that area for this street where you can find a lot of prostitutes and trafficked girls. And this is a really, an area that is very, it can be really dangerous. There's a lot of closed kind of private businesses down there, and you can see a lot of men on the streets for sure. There's still a lot of businesses, and there does seem to be, some lively, it definitely is a lively economy down there for sure, but you can tell that it is haunted by these practices that are happening behind closed doors.
All right, thank you both for being here. Denise Tejada and Natalie Bettendorf with Youth Radio. That does it for us. I'm Thuy Vu. Thanks so much for watching. Next week, join us for a KQED Newsroom special, Stand Up San Quentin. We'll get an inside look at a rehabilitation program where prisoners write and perform their own life stories. For all of KQED's news coverage, please go to kqednews.org. A KQED Newsroom special, Stand Up San Quentin.
So I covered myself in tattoos of hate and violence.
An inside look at a rehabilitation program where prisoners write and perform their own life stories.
I can't joke. I'm nervous. That's what this is.
Howl up, howl up, ho. People in prison are people. They're as complex as you and I.
Coming up on KQED Newsroom Friday night at 8.